My name is David Higgins. In terms of my presentation today, I thought we'd spend a riveting 15 minutes in the company of the other bit of European regulation that occupying government mind at the moment. What I'd like to do is talk to you a bit about the implementation of NIS and what it's done to security posture, and then maybe take a look at what that means for organisations that are not necessarily operators of essential services or digital service providers. In terms of me, I do lots of things. I've got a background in secure government. I've done some work in healthcare. I've done some work in energy distribution. I've done a good stint in national security, so if we could just keep that between us, that would be much appreciated. And most recently, I am an accredited external reviewer for the Infrastructure Project Authority, looking at high risk and high threat programs. Thanks very much. So in classic presenter style, I'll tell you what I'm going to tell you. I'll talk to you a bit about NIS, what it is, what operators of essential services and DSPs are up to. Some helpful guidance from those lovely people who live in a secret office around the corner in Victoria, National Cyber Security Centre. If anybody's in this morning, don't put your hand up. I'll then take a quick look at the NHS as an exemplar of how NIS was implemented. And I will name check a bunch of people at the NHS at the end, because they're really good guys to get to know if you're interested in this kind of thing. And then I'll try and pull out from that some of the things that I think are pertinent, if you're not an OES, but still pertinent in terms of your security posture. Okay. So what is it? It's a bit of, it's actually a European directive. And for those of you who had to work with GDPR, which was a regulation when it came out of Europe, NIS was a directive, which means it was up to individual member states to work out how to implement the intent. And it's written in wonderfully regulatory language, and we'll get to that in a minute. But really, the purpose of NIS was to address the threats that to the technology that underpins a digital economy, rather than necessarily it being kind of infrastructure security for the infrastructure security's own extent. And really, in terms of the implementation in the UK, it was split into operators of essential services, and that's things like water, energy, healthcare and transport. And then the DSPs, who are things like search engines, perhaps DHCP type services, online marketplaces. And the sort of the threshold is, does it do harm in some way, or would a compromise of the digital services that underpin those business services, would that cause harm in some way? So again, the lovely people at the National Cyber Security Centre act as the SPOC, single point of control for this in respect to the regulation, and they also act as sort of the top level CSIRT for UK incidents. And of course, each OES and RDSP is overseen by an individual competent authority. There isn't a single competent authority for NIS, so Health has Department of Health and Social Care, Energy has BASE, so on and so forth. As ever with European regulation, there's some big numbers on the bottom if you get it wrong. And the penalty regime sort of goes from about £1 million to 17 million quid based on the impact of the incident. So, you know, there's kind of 4 layers of incident in this in terms of no impact. Reduction of service, material impact on service, and then, most importantly, threat to life and adverse impact on the UK economy. And when I was thinking about the NHS as potentially the exemplar for this, and I know they're going to talk a bit about WannaCry this afternoon, when you think about that WannaCry, the impact of that WannaCry incident on the NHS, was it a threat to life? Well, it certainly stopped clinical process, didn't it? So I think there's a few people nodding in the audience, so thank you. There's certainly a certain risk associated with that. But when you actually talk to some of the competent authorities, invariably, you know, it's the government finding itself, which is kind of an odd one. But actually it really exists to encourage good practice. And that I think I'll come back to that, about how you get the attention of management and how this need to sort of to protect digitally enabled services, how important that is in respect to some corporate position. So the wonderful piece of regulatory speak, I've highlighted some of the broad words that they're using here. I'd like to point out that you need to take appropriate and proportionate technical and organisational measures That's a wonderfully broad statement, isn't it? And you tend to find this throughout the regulation, that, and there's no specific measure within the regulation itself, although perhaps we'll talk more about that when we do the National Cybersecurity Centre. I was trying to think, I've got a Nicholas Witchell moment. Appropriate approach to technical organisational measures. Obviously, you need to minimise the impact of incidents. Certainly, there's a great phrase in here, which I might have on a T-shirt at some point, where you take those technical measures or those measures to limit the impact of incidents. They need to be state-of-the-art. You'll notice they don't say it's got to be X kind of technology or Y kind of technology. It's got to be state-of-the-art. And that really reflects the regulations' view of the fact that it's a really dynamic threat perimeter. So if they said you've got to do X now, in 6 months' time that won't be sufficient. And you need to quantify what state-of-the-art stuff you need in respect of the risk and the threat perimeter that surrounds you. And you also need to interact with your competent authority who may give you direction or come and undertake audits to make sure you're doing that. And then last but not least, in the event of an incident, and quantification of incidents I think is quite an interesting one, you need to notify the competent national authority within regulatory time limits, which for this is 72 hours. Okay. So that was the overall sort of regulatory framework, and really helpfully the guys at the National Cybersecurity Centre came up with sort of 4 particular areas and some indication, I guess, of things that you could do or quality criteria. And if you go on the National Cybersecurity website, National Cyber Centre Security website, they give you sort of the corresponding levels, if you like, or thresholds of what they believe is a successful approach to mitigation. So obviously they're expecting to manage security risks through good governance, through explicit risk management, to understand which assets are likely to be subject to compromise and have the impact, in terms of that hierarchy of risks, and look at your supply chain. And when you look at this, it actually doesn't look that different to GDPR really, except that GDPR is sort of in respect of personal data as compared to, I guess, digitally supported business. You need to take a look at how you defend systems against attacks. So there's policy and process, identity and access control, which we heard about a bit this morning, data and system physical security, resilience, and perhaps most important, staff awareness and training, because this is another compliance mountain for staff to deal with. So you need to make sure that staff are aware that when they're undertaking their daily activity, they're looking at this not only from all the other regulatory imperatives or standards-based imperatives that they need to have, but also from a NIS perspective as well. And then last couple, obviously detecting cybersecurity events. And I guess this is kind of where they meant state-of-the-art, right? Security monitoring and anomaly detection. I do quite a lot on anomalous behaviour detection and some of the precursors associated with that. And last but not least, response and recovery planning and process improvement. I think that process improvement one's quite interesting because you need to practice this stuff. You need some kind of, I think I was in a webinar the other week, we talked about muscle memory in terms of incident response. Of course, you only really get to practice incident response when you're in an incident, and what you need to do is try and bring that back further up the practice chain, if you like. And there are, I will mention one particular network provider, other network providers are available, that have a lab where you can go and play and do this kind of stuff. And I think practice is really quite important. You don't really want to test this process the first time you have a major crisis on your hands. So in terms of the NHS, why did I pick them? Well, it's a big distributed organisation. I think it has got the potential of some threat to life if things go horribly wrong. And it's actually quite a rich, compliance and security assurance landscape. I know the guys up at NHS Digital in Leeds have taken NIS to their heart, but they've also got a lot of other things that they need to look at as well in terms of providing general capability into the NHS. And they have a whole range of compliance that they have to deal with. GDPR, NIS, Cyber Essentials Plus, which I think is the target for the NHS by 2021. Shoot me if I've got that date wrong. Obviously, they've got their NHS National Data Guardian 10 steps. For those of you in the NHS, that's about how you actually protect data. I think it used to be called Caldecott Guardians back in about 2003. That's showing my age there. Obviously, they use NIST as a risk control framework. And what they've done, and it's a great thing if you can actually get to see it, is they've developed a sort of integrated data security and protection toolkit, and it's an online assessment toolkit that is used by trusts to assess really their security posture. And I'll sort of mention a couple of names from the NHS at the end who you might want to look up on LinkedIn or maybe see if you can find. So what difference did it make to the NHS? They had some fundamental organisational changes. This was owned at trust level as much as anywhere. So you had both a management position that fully recognised its exposure in terms of NIS, potentially those fines, but also the staff within those trusts were given the right knowledge to handle data in the appropriate way and to identify and respond to an incident. Technology, so there was post WannaCry, there was a certain amount of capital funding which seems to have tailed off a bit, but obviously in terms of things like network anomaly detection and so on and so forth, that kind of thing. There's an additional burden of coping with assurance from yet another, somebody coming around to ask you pointed questions about your compliance position. But perhaps most importantly, and this is one of the lessons that I think that happens sort of beyond outside of NIS, it's a frequency of risk assessment. With GDPR, I think it's about every year you undertake a risk assessment and you do DPAAs when you have a substantive change. Really for NIS, you're in continual risk assessment because that's part of the dynamic nature of the state of the art and being able to be kind of aware of your risk environment. Obviously they had to expand their toolkit and they had to expand their audit frameworks, keeping an eye on the clock. What else did they do? Well, they had to make some substantive changes to their incident analysis and processes in terms of the decision tree as to whether this was a NIS-related incident and who they told. They actually implemented centralised reporting for trusts to put security incidents into and then aggregate those up and send those up to NHS England and VHSC. There's certainly an assessment of the supply chain, and it's quite fuzzy, I think, in terms of, if you're an OES, are your supply chain part of the OES problem? Are they an RDSP in their own right? But certainly some assessment around that. An extension to governance in terms of the DHSC as competent authority, and then cost of implementation, according to the National Cybersecurity Guidance, should not be a consideration, but of course it is, right? And the NHS has been struggling, I think, with funding post WannaCry, and I'll be interested to hear how that's gone when I listen to the talk later on this afternoon. So really, what can I give you in terms of if you're not an OES organisation? Well, I think these rules apply. You need the appropriate management responsibility and corporate governance in respect of security posture, and that the threat of the fine is there, but also the threat of compromise and loss of that digital service. I think the assessment of impact on service availability, and I particularly put DWP payments in there, because you had a really substantial outage at the DWP and they couldn't make payments. Would that be an essential service? Well, it would be if you're in receipt of the benefit, isn't it? Certainly look at your risk analysis frequency. Risk analysis, whereas a bit like birthdays, we'll have them once a year. Look more at that, and certainly think about your incident analysis process in terms of at what point do you want to start to escalate and who to about what. Certainly if there's criminal activity in there, you need to have a think about that. And then maintaining state of the art in a dynamic environment, potentially in a resource constrained environment. How do you continue to refine your security posture? And really fine shouldn't be the key driver for this. I think it should be about maintaining an appropriate security posture in respect of your threat perimeter. There's a bunch of things that you can do there. I've not got very much time. I talked earlier about the sort of the war room model. There are other network providers that are available. Palo Alto have a war room, I think, based in Amsterdam, that they will encourage their clients or potential clients to go and run their kind of incident process. They'll sort of red team you there if you like. Other suppliers are available. And finally, in the last 5 seconds, anybody recognise this ship? I'm channeling my inner Celine Dion here. Yeah, it's the Titanic. Does compliance make you secure? The Titanic was fully compliant with the regulations in respect of lifeboat numbers and seats on those lifeboats when it was designed, when it was launched and when it was operated. And it was based on gross tonnage of the vessel, not the number of people on board. And as we know, there is always a bigger iceberg. My name is David Higgins. Thank you very much for your time.